Rain hammered against the diner windows like a warning the world refused to ignore, but inside, something far quieter and far more powerful was about to change two lives forever. It started with a single choice, one so small it could have been forgotten by the next morning. Yet weeks later, that same moment would ripple outward in ways no one could have imagined. Before we dive in, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that even the smallest act can change a life, take a second to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps stories like this alive. The diner was nearly empty that morning, the kind of place where the scent of coffee clung to the air and the red vinyl booths had seen more heartbreak than laughter. Daniel sat by the window, his tired eyes tracing the rain as it blurred the outside world into something distant and unreachable. Across from him sat his 5-year-old daughter, Lily, swinging her legs beneath the table, her innocence untouched by the weight pressing down on her father's shoulders. Daniel hadn't slept much the night before. Bills were piling up, his job barely covered rent, and every day felt like walking a tightrope with no safety net. Being a single father had never been part of his plan, but life rarely followed plans. Since his wife had passed away, everything had become a quiet battle, one he fought alone, hiding his fear behind soft smiles for Lily. Their breakfast was simple. 2 slices of toast, 1 sandwich, and a cup of coffee. Daniel stretched longer than it deserved. He had calculated every coin in his pocket before walking in, making sure it would be just enough. Lily didn't notice the way he skipped his own meal more often than not, convincing her he simply wasn't hungry. A woman stepped inside, soaked from head to toe, her hair clinging to her face as if the rain refused to let her go. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than just a lack of sleep. Her clothes were worn, her shoes barely holding together, and her eyes carried something heavier than hunger, something like defeat. She hesitated near the entrance, glancing around as if unsure whether she belonged there at all. The few people inside avoided her gaze, turning back to their meals, pretending not to notice. It was easier that way. But Daniel noticed. He watched as she approached the counter, quietly asking something the waitress shook her head to. The woman nodded, forcing a small, broken smile before turning away, her shoulders sinking just a little lower. For a moment, Daniel looked back at Lily. She was humming softly, unaware of the silent exchange happening across the room. Then he looked at the sandwich in front of him, the only real food they had that morning. It wasn't a decision that came easily. His stomach tightened, reminding him how little he had eaten in the past day. He thought about the long hours ahead, the work, the exhaustion. He thought about Lily, about needing to stay strong for her. But then he thought about the woman. Something inside him refused to stay quiet. Without overthinking it, Daniel stood up, picked up his plate, and walked toward her. The diner seemed to fall even quieter, as if the world itself paused to watch what would happen next. He didn't say much. He simply offered the sandwich, his hand steady despite everything inside him. The woman stared at it, then at him, confusion flickering across her face before something else replaced it, something raw and unguarded. For a moment, it looked like she might refuse. Then her hands trembled as she accepted it. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic words exchanged. Just a quiet thank you, barely audible over the rain, and a look in her eyes that said more than anything else could. It was the look of someone who hadn't been seen in a very long time. Daniel nodded, gave a small, reassuring smile, and returned to his seat as if it were nothing. Lily looked up at him, tilting her head slightly, curious. He simply smiled at her and took a sip of his now lukewarm coffee. The moment passed just like that. The rain kept falling, the diner returned to its quiet rhythm, and life moved on. Or so it seemed. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that morning slowly faded into the background of Daniel's busy, exhausting life. There were job shifts that stretched too long, bills that never seemed to shrink, and nights where sleep felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. But something had changed even if he didn't realize it, because somewhere out there that small act of kindness had taken root. 3 weeks later, Daniel came home to find something unusual waiting for him, a letter. It was different from the usual stack of bills and notices, the envelope thicker, the paper heavier. His name was written neatly across the front, in a handwriting he didn't recognize. At first, he assumed it was another demand he couldn't meet. But when he opened it, his hands began to shake. Inside was a formal document, stamped and signed, along with a short note that made his breath catch in his throat. It explained that he had been named in a legal matter and was requested to meet with a group of lawyers regarding an urgent issue. He had no connection to anything legal, no relatives with wealth, no reason for something like this to happen. Yet there it was. The following day, with uncertainty weighing heavily on him, Daniel walked into a building far more polished than anywhere he had ever been. The floors gleamed, the air felt colder, and everything about it reminded him just how out of place he was. He almost turned around, but something pushed him forward. When he was finally led into a conference room, the sight that greeted him left him frozen in place. Sitting at the far end of the table was the same woman from the diner, only now she looked completely different. Her hair was neatly styled, her clothes elegant and refined, and the exhaustion that once defined her had been replaced by a quiet strength. Yet her eyes, the same eyes that had held so much pain, were unmistakable. Daniel's mind struggled to catch up. Before he could even process what was happening, one of the lawyers began to speak, explaining that the woman was not who she had seemed that day. She was, in fact, the sole heir to a vast estate, one that had been tied up in legal disputes for years. The morning Daniel met her had been one of the lowest points in her life, cut off from her resources, stripped of everything she once knew, and left to navigate a world that had suddenly turned its back on her. And in that moment, when she had nothing, a stranger had given her something priceless: kindness. The lawyers continued, their words blending together as Daniel tried to steady himself. The woman had finally regained control of her inheritance, and with it, the power to make choices about what came next. And she had made one. She wanted to change his life. What followed didn't feel real. Financial support, a fully paid home, an education fund for Lily, and a job opportunity that would give Daniel the stability he had fought so hard to find. It was more than he had ever dared to hope for, and it had all started with a sandwich. As Daniel stood there overwhelmed, his thoughts drifted back to that rainy morning. He hadn't expected anything in return. He hadn't even thought about it twice. Yet here he was, standing at the edge of a completely different future. The woman met his gaze, and in that silent moment, everything that needed to be said passed between them. Gratitude, understanding, and the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the smallest acts carry the greatest weight. Life didn't magically become perfect overnight. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. And Lily, with her bright smile and endless curiosity, finally got to see her father breathe a little easier. Now, before we reach the end of this story, if this moment touched your heart in any way, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. Stories like this remind us of the kind of world we can build, one small act at a time. Because the truth is, we often underestimate the power of what we do for others. We think it's too small, too insignificant to matter, but sometimes it changes everything. Special request: comment below with one word, e-kindness, if you believe even the smallest good deed can come back in unexpected ways. The rain that day had seemed endless, cold, and unforgiving. But in the middle of it, one quiet decision had created a ripple that reached far beyond what anyone could see. And somewhere out there right now, someone is standing at their own crossroads, holding the chance to make a difference. Maybe it won't change their life overnight. Maybe they'll never know what becomes of it, but just like Daniel, they might one day discover that kindness has a way of finding its way back home. The first few days after that meeting felt unreal, like Daniel had stepped into someone else's life and was just waiting to be asked to leave. He kept expecting a mistake. Even as the papers were signed, as the lawyers explained every detail with calm precision, as keys to a modest but beautiful home were placed into his trembling hands, something inside him refused to fully believe it. Life had taught him to expect loss, not miracles. And yet, here he was holding proof that sometimes, against all odds, things could change. Still, change doesn't erase the past overnight. The first night in the new house, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the walls, listening to the unfamiliar silence. There were no creaks from old pipes, no distant noise from neighbors through thin walls, no constant reminders of struggle. It was peaceful, but also unsettling. Lily, on the other hand, adapted instantly. She ran through the house with wide-eyed wonder, her laughter filling every room as if she was planting pieces of joy in places that had never known her before. Her small hands touched everything: the soft couch, the clean kitchen counters, the window that let in warm sunlight instead of gray city gloom. For her, it wasn't strange, it was magic. And slowly watching her, Daniel began to feel it too. The job opportunity he had been offered turned out to be more than just work. It was stability, a position at one of the women's companies, tailored not as charity, but as a genuine chance. He was trained, guided, and supported, not pitied. For the first time in years, he felt valued not for what he lacked, but for what he could become. But even as life improved, Daniel couldn't shake one thought. Why him? That question followed him everywhere, through his first day at work, through quiet dinners with Lily, through moments when he caught himself smiling for no reason at all. He wasn't used to happiness that didn't come with a price. And eventually, he realized he needed an answer. So one afternoon, after weeks of hesitation, he requested to meet her again. This time, it wasn't in a cold conference room. It was in a quiet garden behind one of the company's buildings, a place filled with soft sunlight and the gentle sound of water flowing from a nearby fountain. It felt calm, almost symbolic, like a space meant for truths that couldn't be spoken elsewhere. She was already there when he arrived, dressed simply this time, without the sharp formality of that first meeting. She looked human, not distant, not untouchable. Just someone who had been through something and come out changed. Daniel didn't know how to begin, so he didn't. He simply sat down, letting the silence settle between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same quiet strength he remembered. But now there was warmth in it too. She told him about those weeks before the diner, about how everything had fallen apart at once: legal battles, betrayals, people she trusted turning away when things got difficult. She had lost more than money. She had lost faith. That morning when she walked into the diner, she wasn't just hungry, she was empty, not physically, but emotionally. She had reached a point where she believed the world had nothing left to offer her except indifference. And then he happened. Not with grand gestures, not with dramatic words, just a simple act that asked for nothing in return. That, she explained, was what stayed with her. Not the sandwich, the intention behind it. Daniel listened quietly, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like someone who had changed a life. He felt like a man who had just done what anyone should have done. But she gently shook her head. That wasn't true, because not everyone does. She told him that after she regained her inheritance, she could have done anything, bought anything, built anything. But the one thing she couldn't ignore was the memory of someone who gave when he had nothing. She didn't want to just repay kindness. She wanted to multiply it. That's why helping him wasn't just about gratitude. It was about creating something bigger, a ripple effect, a chance for him to live a life where he could continue being the person he already was without the weight that had been holding him back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. And because some truths don't need responses, they just need to be understood. From that day forward, Daniel's life didn't just improve, it expanded. He became more confident at work, not because everything was easy, but because he finally believed in the possibility of a future. He started planning again, dreaming again. Small things at first, like taking Lily to places she had only seen in books, or saving money not out of fear, but out of purpose. And Lily, she flourished. Her laughter grew louder, her curiosity deeper, her world bigger. She made friends, discovered new passions, and began to see life not as something to survive, but something to explore. But perhaps the most profound change wasn't in what they had gained. It was in what they chose to give. Daniel never forgot where he came from, and he never forgot that morning. So in his own quiet way, he started doing what he could for others. It wasn't grand. It wasn't public. Sometimes it was as simple as buying a meal for someone who needed it, or helping a struggling coworker without expecting recognition. Because now he understood something deeply. Kindness doesn't need to be big to be powerful. Years later, the story of that single act would still live on, not in headlines or news articles, but in the lives it touched along the way. In the people Daniel helped, in the people they helped. and in the invisible chain of moments that connected them all. And somewhere in the middle of it all, one truth remained unchanged. That rainy morning in the diner had never really ended. It had just continued. Now, if this story touched your heart even a little, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. You never know who might need to hear something like this today, because stories like this aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be lived. Special request. Before we close, comment the word hope if you believe that even in the hardest moments, something beautiful can still begin. In the end, Daniel never became rich in the way people usually measure wealth. But he became something far greater. He became someone who knew without a doubt that even the smallest act of kindness can echo across time, returning in ways no one can predict. And maybe, just maybe, the next time rain falls somewhere in the world and someone hesitates before making a choice, they'll remember a story like this and choose kindness anyway.